time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Today Labor announced our support for 10 days paid domestic and family violence leave to be put into the National Employment Standards. Will the Prime Minister join with Labor and support this very important reform?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank the honourable member for his question, and I was pleased to be with him this morning at the launch of White Ribbon Day, where we both made the commitment, yet again, to bring an end to violence against women. Not all disrespect of women leads to violence against women, but that is where all violence against women begins. Respect for women must be at the very heart of what it means to be an Australian, and that's why we are taking strong action right now to stop family and domestic violence at the start. Last week we launched the National Domestic Violence Orders Scheme, which ensures that those who breach domestic violence orders from the court will be in breach of the law. We're amending the Family Law Act to stop perpetrators directly cross-examining a victim in family violence matters. We're introducing the Family Violence and Other Measures Bill this week to criminalise, as I noted, the breach of personal protection orders issued under the Family Law Act. Now, turning to paid family and domestic violence leave, the Fair Work Commission recently rejected the ACTU's claim to introduce 10 days of paid family and domestic violence leave into all modern awards, but it is still considering the role of unpaid family and domestic violence leave. Now, we respect, as honourable members know, the independence of the Commission. We await that decision and will consider it very carefully. But regardless of what the Commission decides, Mr Speaker, Australian men must think about what they can do to advance equality and call out violence whenever they see it. In our roles as fathers, sons, brothers, colleagues, mates and leaders, all of us are capable of saying that behaviour, that language is not okay when we see someone showing disrespect. And I want to remind the honourable member, the Leader of the Opposition, that he recently made a very deliberate decision to visit the CFMEU picket line at the Oakey Creek North Mine, where the union has been running an outrageous campaign of vile abuse.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Isaacs will cease interjecting. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, the question's about domestic violence leave.
I haven't called the Prime Minister yet. Members will cease interjecting. I've taken the Manager of Opposition Business's point of order. I'm listening closely to the Prime Minister. If people had listened to all of the Prime Minister's answer with respect to the drivers of domestic violence, I think the Prime Minister is in order. The Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, that objection, that point of order from the member for Watson, shows how he fundamentally misunderstands the cause of domestic violence. It is disrespect for women. You have got members of the CFMEU threatening domestic violence, threatening it.
The member for Griffith.
And does he condemn it? Oh no. His leader goes to show his solidarity. Let me say this to you, Mr Speaker. It's about time the Leader of the Opposition stood up for something. He could stand up for respect for women. He could stand up for Australia. He could stand up for the security of our country.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Barara has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister advise the House what the government is doing to protect Australia's sovereignty against foreign influence? Is the Prime Minister aware of Australia's sovereignty being compromised?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. The first responsibility of every government is to keep Australia safe. That is our job. That's our #1 priority. And there are many overt security threats. North Korea, Islamist terrorism, violent criminal gangs. But it also means countering the threat posed by foreign interference, by those people or governments, foreign governments, who seek to interfere with and influence our political processes and in so doing so to corrupt our democracy. Now, Mr Speaker, we cannot allow the sovereignty of Australia to be compromised in this way. It is the responsibility of this government and this parliament. This should not be a partisan issue. This should be one where we all stand and say we will together upgrade our laws to keep our democracy safe. Surely that is the least we can ask of every member of this
Member
parliament.
for Moreton.
Now, Mr Speaker, what we've announced today and what we'll introduce into the parliament this week is a changes to the law relating to foreign donations, but above all relating to foreign interference. And as I've described with the Attorney-General and the Finance Minister, we do need changes to the law to ensure that those who seek to lobby and influence public opinion and parliamentary activities and government actions on behalf of foreign interests should be upfront about it. They should be on a register. And those who do so covertly, contrary to our national interest, they should be paying a price under the criminal law for that criminal action. Now, Mr Speaker, recently we have seen Senator Dastyari put at risk the security of our nation. Now, the Labor Party think it's a big joke. They do. They think it's a big joke. They think that it's okay for a Labor senator to take money for himself and then go and change policy, and then go and read out talking points that could have been written in Beijing on the subject of the South China Sea. And then, when he had reason to believe that his benefactor, Mr Wang, may be under surveillance by Australian security services, he rushed to Mr Wang's side to tip him off and make sure that when they had a chat, it was without any of the phones being nearby. This is a test of the character of the Leader of the Opposition. Does he stand for Australia? Does he stand up for our national security?
Member for
Well, if
Isaacs.
he does, then he knows
Prime Minister's time has
Dastyari has to
concluded.
go.
The Prime Minister, I remind, will refer to senators by their correct titles. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Prime Minister's media team distributed a photograph of the Leader of the Opposition with Mr Huang. Can the Prime Minister explain why the photograph was cropped so that the Prime Minister himself was cut out of the photo?
Manager of Opposition Business.
That's what you distributed.
Manager of Opposition Business.
Cut it off, and that's the photo.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume
From
his
your-
seat. Pause. The Prime Minister has the call.
The member for Watson. He is defending.
Members on both
He's
sides.
feebly defending the
Member
Leader
for
of the
Isaacs will
Opposition.
remove the prop or he'll
Who-
remove himself.
Who?
Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. As an act of kindness, I should have stopped it. The Treasurer is a compassionate man, and he knew that we should have stopped the member for Watson from going down this line. Well, anyway, yesterday there was a photograph produced in a street scene in Sydney of me and many other people, including Mr Wang. There they were. I think it was a Chinese New Year function. Thousands of people were there. And there, you know, Mr Speaker.
Member for
and
Lindsay.
guess who else was there? The Leader of the Opposition. Well, fair enough. I make no criticism of him being there. Half of Sydney was there. But what I do criticise the Leader of the Opposition for is this. He has belittled and betrayed Australia by leaving Senator Dastyari in the Senate. Because I'll tell you this, Senator Dastyari sold out Australia. And you know, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party have made themselves the subject of contempt everywhere and nowhere
Member for
more
Melbourne
so
Ports.
than in China. Can you imagine how the Chinese government would look at this alternative Prime Minister? They'd say, this guy was prepared to
Member for
allow
Melbourne
one of
Ports
his
is
front
warned.
bench to switch on a matter of national security in return for, what was it, $1,600? Well, I tell you what, Senator Dastyari's integrity and the Labor Party's foreign policy was pretty cheap. It was pretty easy to acquire. And that is exactly what happened. Labor will be held in contempt. China respects strength. They respect honesty. They expect the Australian government to stand up for Australia's interests, to be frank and honest. And when we differ, do so honestly, not to sell out Australia, for a few $1,000s. And then, when
member for
Labor
Melbourne
tries
Ports
to
has
suggest
been warned.
that this is all Senator Dastyari's own errors of judgment, oh dear Senator Dastyari, says the Leader of the Opposition, oh, he won't get any more chances and other than the 3 or 4 he's had already. What do? Nothing. Zero. He has sold Australia's security interests out, and this man, who wants to be Prime Minister of Australia, will not move. Well, I'll tell you why. Because Senator Dastyari put the Leader of the Opposition in his job,
The Prime
and he's
Minister's
worried
time
that without
has
him,
concluded.
he won't.
The member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on why it is important for all parliamentarians to act in Australia's interests, particularly on matters of foreign policy and national security?
Members on both sides. The member for Isaacs is now warned. The Foreign Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, when members and senators are elected to this place, they swear an oath, pledging their allegiance to Australia and the Australian people. And as representatives of Australia and our people, it is our solemn duty to act in the interests of Australia and the Australian people at all times, whether at home or abroad. And we should never advocate the interests of a foreign government at the expense of Australia and its people. Senator Sam Dastyari has engaged in a pattern of conduct that has promoted his self-interest and the interests of a foreign government at the expense of the Australian government in both foreign policy and national security terms. It's been revealed today that Senator Dastyari has been caught out yet again parroting the specific lines of a foreign government. According to an article in the Fairfax Press, in 2015, Senator Dastyari gave an interview to China Economic Net, and he adopted specific terms that, according to 2 academic Chinese experts, were provided, quote, from people well-versed in the political ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, and that, quote, he must be speaking from dot points drafted by someone with close links to the Chinese Communist Party or government, and further that if Senator Dastyari used that term, then he is towing the Chinese Communist Party line. Mr Speaker, then we had the infamous press conference where Senator Dastyari, in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Offices in Sydney, stood in front of an Australian flag at a podium with the Australian coat of arms, inviting his Chinese benefactor to stand alongside when he adopted the lines and the stance of the Chinese government on the issue of the South China Sea, putting him directly at odds with the foreign policy articulated by Labor's Shadow Defence Minister the day before, and directly at odds with the Australian government's long-standing policy. And, Mr Speaker, to top it all off, Senator Dastyari then engaged in counter-surveillance conduct by warning his Chinese benefactor and intending to compromise—
The Foreign Minister's time has concluded. The member for Isaacs.
One job.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to Labor introducing a bill to Parliament to ban foreign political donations over a year ago. And I also refer to former Liberal Trade Minister Andrew Robb saying this about Mr Wang. He's a man of many dimensions, thoughtful. He's a very thoughtful, cerebral fellow. He's a man who thinks about life and how we can improve it. He is a visionary. Is this one of the reasons the Prime Minister has delayed banning foreign political donations for over a year? Is Mr Robb's glowing praise of Mr Wang why the Liberal Party is still taking his money?
Time has concluded. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, there's a big difference between Andrew Robb and Senator Dastyari. Andrew Robb's always put Australia first. He's always put Australia first. Senator Dastyari sold Australia out. And listen,
Members
let's be
on my
quite
left.
clear. Labor had a foreign
The member for
donations
Rankin is warned.
bill in the House, completely and utterly inadequate. Completely and utterly inadequate. It basically only prohibited
Member for Bruce is
donations from foreign bank accounts. So, I mean, you could drive a truck through it. The legislation that Senator Cormann will introduce in the Senate this week is far more comprehensive, as we have described. So we're getting on with that. We're doing it thoroughly, just as I said we would when I spoke at the beginning of the year at the Press Club. Now, Mr Speaker, getting back to this issue of political influence and Senator Dastyari, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition yesterday gave what he sort of claimed was a personal explanation in which he said nothing about what he told Senator Dastyari about ASIO's interest in Mr Wang, if that was the case. He said nothing about why Senator Dastyari was being allowed to remain in the Labor Party. He said nothing about the propriety or otherwise of Senator Dastyari tipping off Mr Wang about the potential for surveillance and then advising him how to take steps to avoid it. Now, the Leader of the Opposition can run as much as he likes. He can avoid taking questions as much as he likes. But this is now not just about Senator Dastyari, it's about him. It's about his failure of leadership. This is a man who wants to be Prime Minister of Australia. He wants to lead a country that Senator Dastyari has betrayed, and what does he do about it? Well, Labor doesn't like the betray word. All right, how do the people on the Labor side describe someone who goes to a foreign national's house and advises them how to avoid being surveilled by ASIO? What do they think ASIO does? ASIO is there to protect us. We, ASIO and the Australian people, expect our elected representatives to defend ASIO, to support them and assist them. Undermining the work of our security service is not the act of a loyal Australian. It is not the act of an Australian senator should undertake, and every day Senator Dastyari remains in the Labor Party is a day that reminds us how unfit they are and their leader is to rule this country.
Members on both sides will cease interjecting. Members on my left, the member for Moreton will leave under 94A. Other members are about to join the member for Moreton. The member for Indi is waiting patiently, and I thank her for that. Just before I call her, I'd like to inform the House we have joining us in the gallery today Mr John Haslam, former member for Canberra. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you, and I'm also pleased to advise the House that we have joining us renowned Australian children's author Mem Fox, who's been here today. On behalf of the House, I extend a welcome to you too, and understand you've been down at the Parliamentary Bookshop. The member for Indi.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, what would it take for this parliament to establish a National Integrity Commission? Over the past fortnight, the opposition and the government have been arguing about integrity, transparency and accountability. Will the Prime Minister commit to a National Integrity Commission to investigate and expose corruption, particularly in Australia, and misconduct, and would it happen in this term?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for Indi for a question, and I want to acknowledge her very keen interest in this issue. Now, Mr Speaker, integrity and transparency, as we've been discussing, are absolutely vital to ensure that we maintain and enhance trust in our democratic system. And that is exactly why we've announced the reforms in respect of foreign interference and foreign political donations today. Now, Australia is consistently ranked by Transparency International as one of the least corrupt countries in the world, but we have, and I'm sure I speak for all honourable members, zero tolerance to corruption. But what we need to do, of course, is to live up to that, and the test now is with the Labor Party in respect of Senator Dastyari. So you don't need an integrity commission to tell you that what Senator Dastyari did was wrong. You don't need an integrity commission, and I'm not contesting the merits of what the honourable member is saying, but you don't need an integrity commission to tell you that every day the Leader of the Opposition leaves Senator Dastyari in the Labor caucus is a day the Labor Party demonstrates its unfitness to lead. Now, Mr Speaker, the establishment of a National Integrity Commission would not better guarantee protection against corruption necessarily. A National Integrity Commission, depending on how it was designed, could add some benefits, but it is something that would need to be considered with great care. Now, Mr Speaker, over the years I have been very sceptical about some of these commissions. As we all know, some of them have done better than others. It's been a pretty patchy performance. We have a very robust multi-agency approach, and what we have, of course, is the Inspector-General of Intelligence and Security that has the powers of a Royal Commission, the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor, the Commonwealth Ombudsman, the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement and Integrity, of particular importance, and the AFP's own Fraud and Anti-Corruption Centre. So we are very focused on ensuring that government, governance, whether it's public service, agencies, politicians, are absolutely held to account, and there is zero tolerance for corruption. Now, there has recently been a Senate Select Committee on a National Intelligence Commission. I noticed that it didn't recommend the establishment of one, but nonetheless its recommendations are being very carefully considered by the government. We absolutely have the same objective: zero corruption, zero tolerance for corruption. We have many agencies that are working on it, and I will always look forward to working with and speaking with the honourable member to see how we can ensure that our zero tolerance for corruption is all better and better carried out into action.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister outline to the House why it is important to have a strong, consistent and considered approach to matters of national security? Indeed, what are the risks for young players when they fail to exercise good judgment on matters of national security?
The member for McEwen is warned. The Minister for Defence Industry,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
representing the Minister for Defence, has the call. The member for Goldstone is also warned.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Canning for his question. Mr Speaker, every member and senator is expected to act in Australia's national interest at all times. The member for Corio obviously gets this, as the Shadow Minister for Defence. Not long ago on Neil Mitchell, on Thursday the 30th of November, when being asked about Senator Dastyari's behaviour over the South China Sea, he said there's essentially a bipartisan position in relation to the South China Sea. So obviously I do think a contrary position to that is against the national interest. So the member for Corio gets it as he buries his head in his papers, Mr Speaker, but not necessarily so much Labor's candidate for Bennelong, Mr Speaker. Labor's candidate for Bennelong,
The member for McEwen
when
has
Senator
been warned.
Dastyari was discovered to have had his personal expenses paid by Top Education Institute, $1,600 in fact, $1,600 of his personal expenses paid. Christina Keneally's advice to Senator Dastyari was to fudge it. On Australian Story, she was asked about it on Australian Story, Mr Speaker. She said, I remember asking him, why did you do this? Like, how are you going to explain this? Why did you do this? And he said, because I didn't want to pay the bill. To which she said, well, you can't say that. Don't say that. So what did she expect Senator Dastyari to actually say? That the dog ate his homework, that the tram got a flat tyre? She was advising him to do what exactly? Not to tell the truth, Mr Speaker, was what Christina Keneally was advising Senator Dastyari to do. She was advising him to fudge the issue, to come up with some other kind of excuse. She didn't realise the gravity of the situation that Senator Dastyari found himself in, where, having had his personal expenses being paid, being compromised by a company with links to the Chinese government, he then changed Labor's policy, for which he suffered a sanction, and then he warned another Chinese donor about how to avoid being surveyed by ASIO or any other government agencies. Mr Speaker, what is it about New South Wales Labor that they don't get how to behave, what the boundaries are for members of parliament and putative ministers? Eddie O'Babe crowned Christina Keneally as the Premier of New South Wales. Senator Dastyari anointed the Leader of the Opposition as the Leader of the Labor Party. Why couldn't the Leader of the Opposition win a clean fight, Mr Speaker? Why did he have to have Senator Dastyari rorting the ballot for the ALP leadership? Why were those 50 votes sent from private homes to Senator Dastyari's office? Who voted for those people? There needs to be an investigation into this, and we will not rest until the Leader of the Opposition orders New South Wales Labor to have an investigation.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, or as he says, the ruler of this country. I refer to the bid by the Chinese company Landbridge to operate the port of Darwin. I also refer to the fact that subsequently Landbridge gave former Liberal Minister for Trade Andrew Robb a part-time position paying $880,000 a year. Is the acceptance of $880,000 a year for a part-time job by a former Liberal minister action that would be caught by the Prime Minister's proposed legislation on foreign interference?
The members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister resume his seat. Members on my left will cease their wall of noise or they won't be here. A number have been warned. A single interjection from any of them will see them ejected. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the honourable member will do everything he can to distract attention from Senator Dastyari and talk about anything at all except the fact that his leader refuses to take the right decision, the decision that a person of strong character, a person determined to protect Australia would take, which is to say to Senator Dastyari, you are out of the Labor Party. The Labor Party seeks to be the government. The Leader of the Opposition seeks to be the Prime Minister. The first job of every government is to protect the nation's safety. National security is the first responsibility. So how do you tolerate somebody in your party room, somebody on your Senate benches, somebody until very recently on your front bench, who has gone to the home of a foreign national, a home very familiar to the Leader of the Opposition, and told him to be wary that he may be being under surveillance from ASIO, and then given him practical advice as to how to avoid it? Does the Leader of the Opposition think that the job of his party and his members is to help ASIO keep Australia safe, or is it simply to sell Australia out? Now, if they think
They're currying favour in Beijing by doing this. They are not. Senator Dastyari is a figure of contempt, despised because the Chinese people are patriots. They stand up for their nation and they can't understand why Australia has an opposition leader who won't stand up for his.
The member for Parkes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer advise the House on the impact that the New South Wales economic recovery has had for the nation, and how is this helping Australia realise its better days ahead? Treasurer, are there any threats to the New South Wales and Australian economy?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Parkes. As a fellow New South Welshman and Blue, he would understand that we cannot underestimate the importance of the New South Wales economy to the national economy. And under the coalition, half of our economic growth last year was from New South Wales, under the strong leadership of the coalition government in New South Wales and the Turnbull government leadership at a national level. There have been some 372,000 jobs that have been created under the coalition government in New South Wales. And as we know, under this government here at a national level, we have around 1,000 jobs being created every month, every week, Mr Speaker, every day, I should say. Unemployment in New South Wales, is lower than the national average at just 4.6%. In New South Wales, we have the longest construction boom going in New South Wales history, and some $5.6 billion of work happening on New South Wales roads. The New South Wales budget is back in surplus, Mr Speaker, and debt was erased last year. Now, it wasn't always that way in New South Wales. This wasn't always the story in New South Wales, because under the Labor government previously, it fell to the bottom of the pack as an economy across the country. Unemployment was above the national average, and debt and deficit reigned in New South Wales under successive Labor premiers. Now, the opposition leader thinks that one of the architects of the economic vandalism in New South Wales, Christina Keneally, should now join the Labor Party ranks here in Canberra as the member for Bennelong. It's bad enough that the Leader of the Opposition's first draft pick in the Senate for New South Wales is Senator Dastyari, who remains his first draft pick for the Senate from New South Wales. Bad enough someone like that, who has been caught cheating on his country, Mr Speaker, metaphorically between the sheets. And what should happen to Senator Dastyari is he should pack his bags and he should get out of the House and he should never come back, Mr Speaker. That's what a real leader of the opposition would do if with that level of betrayal being shown by Senator Dastyari. So it's not bad enough if that's the case. But he has chosen as his first pick in Bennelong someone Eddie Obeid chose, Mr Speaker, to be the Premier of New South Wales. Eddie Obeid, by the way, who is now setting up the Berrima prison branch of the Labor Party, along with Ian McDonald, who is establishing another prison branch of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. And I suspect all of those have visiting rights, not only to see them in prison, but to go to Eddie Obeid's lodge down there in Thredbo, as the member for Watson will remember, Mr Speaker. Who they have chosen in Bennelong, Mr Speaker, goes to the heart of why they are such a risk to this country and why the people of Bennelong should regret Christina Keneally and Labor.
The member for Eden-Monaro.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is His Majesty aware the acting Premier of the Conservative—
The member for Eden-Monaro will resume his seat. The member for Murray. Member for Murray has the call. Member for Murray has the call. Members on my left, the member for Murray has the call and will begin his question, or I'll go to the next question.
Okay. Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on the benefits of all Australians of a well-managed national security agenda? Why it is important to maintain a strong and consistent border protection policies, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. I thank him very much, not only for the strong stance that he takes in relation to border protection, but the very compassionate approach that he has toward welcoming people into our country that are deserving of a new start in life. Now, Mr Speaker, one of the great achievements of this government has been not only have we been able to stop boats, but we have been able to get every child out of detention. Labor put 8,000 children into detention. We've closed 17 detention centres. Labor put 50,000 people on 800 boats and 1,200 people drowned at sea. Now, we've changed all of that policy and we still have the threat. We know that we've turned back 31 boats over the course of the last couple of years, and the people smugglers just treat these human beings like any other commodity. That is, they trade in drugs, in prostitutes, in tobacco. They take money from innocent men, women and children to put them onto boats. They couldn't care less whether they make it to our shores or they go to the bottom of the ocean. And we are not ever, this side of the parliament, Mr Speaker, is never ever going to allow the Labor Party again to undo the success that we have had in relation to securing our borders. But it is concerning when you look at some of the comments made by some of those opposite and some people who would seek to come into this place to represent the Labor Party, when you look at their comments which are directly designed at that very outcome. That is, if you look at the comments of people like Christina Keneally in New South Wales at the moment, who wants to be the member for Bennelong and be an influential voice within the Labor Party, she has on many occasions spoken out against the success of the government's policies and wants to wind back the policies which would see the boats recommence. Now, I think the people of Bennelong want a government that has control of our borders, wants to put national security first, wants to keep our communities safe in this country, and we need to call people out like Christina Keneally because they are dangerous in trying to undo the border protection policies. Now, it is the case, dangerous. Oh, the manager of opposition business interjects. He was an immigration minister when thousands of people arrived and people drowned at sea. I won't be taking a lecture from you, Sunshine. I can certainly assure you of that.
The minister will refer to members by their correct title.
Indeed, Mr Speaker. Let me just say this: if you have a look at the words of Christina Keneally that she's tweeted, that she said on Sky over a long period of time, it is clear that she is wanting to undo regional processing. She's wanting to undo turn back of boats where it's safe to do so. And it is clear that this Leader of the Opposition barely has control of this policy within the Labor Party. The fact is that Christina Keneally would be a disaster as the member for Bennelong, just as she was a disaster as the Premier of New South Wales.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning, the Prime Minister's Liberal colleague Senator Hume said about the visit of Milo Yiannopoulos, and I quote, "A young man swaggers into Canberra, attention-seeking, saying outrageous things, appeasing the far right and getting some media coverage. It sounds like the Coalition Party room." Do his senator's comments accurately describe the government's policy development process under this Prime Minister?
Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I can see why the honourable member was taken by those remarks, because they demonstrated something she obviously lacks, which is a sense of humour. But there is nothing funny about the Labor Party's failure to stand up for Australia's national security. But having said that, Mr Speaker, not everybody is as weak as the Leader of the Opposition when it comes to protecting Australia's security on the Labor benches. Because I've seen in the Herald on the 4th of December a quote from an unnamed Labor MP, must be sitting here today. I wonder who it is. I think I know who it is. Oh, I do. I know who it is. And the quote is this. I know. Your style is unmistakable. The quote is this. It is. He's inimitable. No one else could take him off. The comment is this. The problem for Sam is that every time you look at him, you see someone who's been an agent of foreign influence. And you can't have an agent of foreign influence sitting in the Senate. That's what that unnamed Labor MP said. Brave
Member for
enough to
McEwen
tell
will
the
leave
truth
under 94A.
to Nick McKenzie, but not brave enough to put his name to it.
I
think it's about time
Prime Minister
they
will
stood
resume
up.
his seat. The Prime Minister resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for North Sydney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure. Will the Minister update the House? Will the Minister update the House on the Coalition's record on delivering infrastructure projects across the nation, including for residents in Bennelong and neighbouring communities? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, I do thank the member for North Sydney, who of course is a very strong champion of infrastructure and has very considerable expertise in infrastructure. And he's right to say that the Turnbull government is delivering infrastructure all around the country and certainly working closely with the Berejiklian government in New South Wales. For example, $412 million going into North Connects, $1.5 billion into West Connects, plus a $2 billion concessional loan, $1.7 billion going into Sydney Metro City and South West. And of course all of these will benefit the electorate of North Sydney. They'll also benefit the electorate of Bradfield. For example, people travelling, the electorate of Bennelong, I should say, people travelling through the M2, along the M2, through the electorate of Bennelong will then have better access using North Connects. And of course, as metro-style services, 4 minutes, turn up and go, come to stations like Macquarie Park, Macquarie University and North Ryde, that will deliver enormous benefits to the people of Bennelong. And so too will the commitment made by the Turnbull government jointly with the Berejiklian government to spend $100 million on a new bus interchange at the Macquarie University station. And John Alexander, as the Liberal candidate for Bennelong, has been a very strong champion for that project and for addressing the needs of his electorate, including a reduction in congestion. Now, of course, there are some others who are putting their names forward meekly to serve the people in Bennelong. One of them, it must be acknowledged, does have a big transport project on her CV, the Sydney Metro, where she spent almost $500 million. That's quite impressive. But unfortunately, the $500 million was spent to cancel the project. That is the track record of Christina Keneally, the Labor member, the Labor candidate, and of course the former Premier of Labor Premier of New South Wales, whose distinguished track record when it comes to public transport was to cancel the Sydney Metro. Now, of course, desperately in the 2010 election, they re-announced Parramatta to Epping. And here's what somebody said on election night, August 2010, quotes, "I think given the on-again, off-again nature of transport commitments in this city, we are battling uphill to convince the people of the credibility of that commitment." Who said that? That was the Labor candidate, Maxine McHugh, the failed Labor candidate for Bennelong, telling the truth in 2010, about the failure of Labor's rail. You cannot trust Labor. You cannot trust Christina Keneally. But I'll tell you who you can trust. You can trust John Alexander.
The minister's time has concluded. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last year, after the government became the first majority government in more than 50 years to lose control of the House, the Prime Minister told Neil Mitchell, and I quote, "It won't happen again," and went on to say, "It will not happen again." Since then, it's happened again and again. After losing yet another vote yesterday, can the Prime Minister confirm that his working majority is not a majority and doesn't work?
Members on both sides. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'm so glad that the manager of opposition business is taking such a keen interest in the comings and goings and divisions here and keeping an eye on the numbers. That's terrific. That's terrific. And keeping an eye on Neil Mitchell.
Member for
That's
Perth.
good. But you know, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to predictions about what might happen about members of parliament or senators, what about this?
The member for
6th of
Perth is
December
warned.
2016. Leader of the Opposition, 6th of September. Trust me, he said. Who would do that? Trust me, Senator Dastyari has learnt that lesson very clearly. And then, squaring his shoulders with the determination of a great patriot, the Leader of the Opposition said, "I've made it crystal clear. I don't expect to see this happen again." He knows he's made a mistake. Grinding his teeth with anger and determination, on balance, I'm prepared to give him a second chance. He said, I'm prepared, however, to give him a second chance because I think he can make a contribution to this country. But the problem was, it wasn't our country. It wasn't our country. It was somebody else's country. The character test is very simple. Can the Leader of the Opposition say that Senator Dastyari has put Australia first? He cannot. And unless he can make the case for Senator Dastyari, which he refuses to make, then Senator Dastyari must go. The anonymous commentator to Nick Mackenzie and James Massola, I quoted a moment ago, is dead right. He should not be in the Senate, he should not be in the Labor Party, and the Leader of the Opposition has got to decide whether he is prepared to stand up for Australia, because everybody else in this place does. Everybody else is, except for him, hanging by a thread connected to Senator Dastyari. That is no way to lead, no way to present yourself as the alternative Prime Minister.
The member for McKellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and the Environment. Will the minister update the House on how the government is guaranteeing lower energy prices and a more reliable supply through a national approach to energy policy? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that will adversely affect the hip pocket
The member for McKellar will resume his seat. The member for Perth and Chifley will leave under 94A. The member for Chifley and Perth aren't engaged in a sitcom. They'll be named if they don't leave immediately. The member for McKellar will begin his question again.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and the Environment. Will the minister update the House on how the government is guaranteeing lower energy prices and a more reliable supply through a national approach to energy? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that will hit the hip pocket of hard-working families and businesses in Bennelong and across Australia?
The Minister for Energy and the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for McKellar for his question and know that he strongly supports the efforts by the Turnbull government to create a more reliable and affordable energy system. The efforts that we have undertaken with the gas supplies, which has seen more gas.
Cease interject. The minister just resume his seat for a second. It's very clear what the member for Lindsay and others are doing in trying to mimic the minister from an earlier answer. Frankly, no, let's just call it as it is. You've made the point. It might have been funny the first time, but I'm going to be blunt back. It actually becomes really juvenile. It's not what people come to question time to see. The minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the people of Australia who want lower energy prices don't want the juvenile policies put forward by those opposite, Mr Speaker. They don't want the juveniles in charge, they want the adults in charge, Mr Speaker. They want the adults in charge who are driving lower prices and a more reliable system by entering into agreements with the LNG suppliers to get gas supplied to Australians before it is exported overseas, to pass legislation through this parliament to stop the ability of the networks to game the system, the poles and the wire companies, to get an agreement with the energy retailers to offer a better deal to millions of Australians who are saving hundreds of dollars on their power bills, to take the decisions to invest in major storage projects like Snowy 2.0 and projects in Queensland and South Australia, which will see us create a more stable system. And for the first time, the Turnbull government is undertaking the difficult challenge of integrating energy and climate policy through the National Energy Guarantee. It's taken the advice of the experts from the Energy Security Board. It's had modelling undertaken which will show the Australian average household will save about $120 a year, and the wholesale electricity price will come down by about 23%. So if you are a big paper manufacturer, you could save some $10 million a year. If you own a large supermarket, you could save more than $400,000 a year. If you are a chemical factory, you could save more than $1.4 million a year. And that is why this policy has been well received right across the board. But I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches that would hurt the hip pocket of the people of Bennelong? Well, just two words. Christina Keneally, Mr Speaker. Christina Keneally. Because when she was a power broker in New South Wales Labor, energy prices went up by 60% between 2006 and 2011. That's not good news for the people of Epping. That's not good news for the people of Eastwood, Mr Speaker. And we know that the Leader of the Opposition, with his policy of an emissions intensity scheme, will see Australian average households more than $300 worse off, Mr Speaker. That is the policy being put forward by the Labor Party. So if you want higher energy prices, support Christina Keneally. But if you want a more stable system, more affordable power, get behind John Alexander and vote Liberal in Bennelong.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister promised that every Australian would have access to the NBN by the end of 2016. It's now the end of 2017. Most Australians due to receive the HFC, including over 40,000 premises in Bennelong, do not know when they will get access to the NBN. Prime Minister, when will the people in Ryde and East Ryde, West Ryde, North Ryde, Meadowbank, Putney and Ermington get access to the NBN like you promised them?
The Prime Minister has the call. The Minister representing the Minister for Communications.
Well, I do thank the Leader of the Opposition for that question. It does take an extraordinary lack of historical knowledge to be suggesting that this government has anything to apologise for when it comes to the rollout of the NBN. Because, you know, when you look at the numbers are quite instructive. The numbers are quite instructive. Let's look at the NBN's corporate plan published in December 2010. In December 2010, when the Prime Minister was either Mr Rudd or Ms Gillard, one or the other, the claimed target, the number of premises that was supposed to be covered by June 30, 2011, was 223,000. What they actually delivered? 10,575. June 30, 2012. What did these rollout geniuses from Labor deliver when they'd promised 496,000? They delivered 95,799. What did they deliver on June 30, 2013, when they'd promised 1.7 million? They'd promised 1.7 million. This wasn't off the cuff, by the way. This was in their business plan. They'd promised 1.7 million by June 30, 2013. They delivered 280,000. Now, that is not a high
Minister
distinction.
will resume his seat for a second. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On direct relevance, the question was, when will the people in Ryde and Ermington and Putney, when will they get their HFC NBN? When?
The Minister has the call.
And if you were in government, they wouldn't have got it now, and they wouldn't be getting it for a very long time, because
the Minister
your
will
track
refer to
record
members
was
by their
dismal.
correct title.
Your track record was hopeless. What you delivered on the NBN was a pathetic joke, and you claim to suggest that if there were a change, that somehow you'd do a better job. But the historical record does not lie. By June 2013, when you had promised to deliver 1.7 million, what you'd actually delivered was less than 20% of that. That's not a high distinction. That's not a distinction. That's not a credit. That's not even a pass. That's a fail. That is a fail. And that is Labor's record of NBN failure. 6 years of dismal NBN failure. And now they expect that the people of Bennelong will be so naive and so credulous as to believe that they've got a plan that's going to do better than the performance we are seeing under the Turnbull government, where 6.5 million premises are now able to connect. What is their plan? We've got no idea what their plan is. Their plan at the last election was that they were going to deliver 2 million more premises with fibre and not spend an extra dollar. They were going to reinvent the rules of economics. It's a miracle. Magic pudding economics comes to the NBN. You have zero credibility on the NBN.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Banks.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Human Services. Will the Minister update the House on action the coalition government has taken to improve access to Medicare services in my electorate of Banks, in Bennelong and across Sydney? How does this compare with alternative approaches?
The Minister for Human Services has the call.
Well, can I thank the member for Banks for his question? Last year, Mr Speaker, my department processed 399 million Medicare claims, totalling $22 billion, $4 billion more than when we first came to office. Now, in Bennelong, 88% of those claims are bulk billed, and that is up from 82% when Labor was in office, and 99% of the time, Mr Speaker, they are processed digitally, which means that very rarely does a person ever need to go into a Medicare or Centrelink office. So in Bennelong, Mr Speaker, people are accessing more services, they're getting more bulk billing, and they're doing it more conveniently. Now, I'm asked about alternatives, and we all know that the Labor Party cannot be trusted in relation to saying anything about Medicare truthfully. And the Labor candidate for Bennelong, Christine Keneally, is cut from exactly the same cloth, because from day one of her campaign, she's been misleading the people of Bennelong about Medicare. And first, for example, Mr Speaker, she condemned the merger of the Eastwood Medicare office with the Ryde Service Centre. But little did she tell the people of Bennelong, but the Labor Party actually started this program, and they merged 128 Medicare offices and had plans to merge every single one. And the member for Sydney herself, she stated this in 2010 when she was Human Service Minister, and I can quote from her press release, which she said, by the end of 2014, all Centrelink, Medicare and child support offices will be co-located. The rank hypocrisy, Mr Speaker, of the Labor Party on this issue. But this is not the only time that Christine Keneally misled the people of Bennelong, because she also claimed that in the last week of September 2017, she was going to have to wait more than an hour at the Ryde Service Centre. However, little does Christina Keneally know that we keep very detailed records of the wait times at the service centres, and the average wait time for that particular week in question was only 12 minutes. But I went through every single day and I looked at the first day of the week on the Monday, there was 307 people went to that service centre. How many waited for 60 minutes, waited for an hour? 0. Tuesday, 278 people, 0 waited for an hour. Wednesday, 304 people,
0 waited for an hour. Thursday, 208 people, 0 waited for an hour. And Friday, the last day, 274 people went through the ride service centre. And guess how many waited for an hour? Absolutely 0. Not a single person in the entire week in question waited for more than an hour, according to our official record. This is Labor hypocrisy. Again, Labor misleading the Australian people.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Greenway.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, when speaking about the chaotic HFC rollout of his second-rate NBN, the Prime Minister said some customers were getting a poor experience. With internet problems now the highest source of new complaints to the telecommunications industry ombudsman, does the Prime Minister know how many customers on his second-rate NBN are having a poor experience, or is he so out of touch that he doesn't care?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the last information I had from the NBN was that there are about 350,000 people connected to the NBN via hybrid fibre coax networks, via HFC networks. The company has advised me that around 20% of them are not getting a satisfactory performance, and that is why they've put the rollout on hold. Put it on hold so that the technical issues can be addressed. Now, I can explain to honourable members precisely what is going on. They are going to improve the experience by upgrading physical infrastructure, such as replacing the taps that connect the network to individual premises. Once that has been done for existing customers and areas that are ready for service, NBN will upgrade all remaining rollout areas. They expect that this will delay the rollout of the further HFC rollout by about 6 months. Now, what the NBN, you've got to remember about HFC, is that the people on the Telstra HFC network, which is what the NBN is taking over, already have very good broadband. In fact, they have, prior to the NBN's rollout, they would have had some of the best fixed-line broadband in the country. So they're not waiting for broadband. They've got good broadband, and the important point the NBN is seeking to ensure is that as their parts of the network get connected to the NBN, their broadband experience improves. And so that is what is going on. The savings, obviously, of using the existing HFC network are enormous. That's one of the reasons why, as the minister said a moment ago, the project can be completed 6 to 8 years sooner and about $30 billion cheaper. HFC is a technology that is used by hundreds of millions of people around the world for high-speed broadband, particularly in North America. There are some technical issues. The NBN is dealing with them, and they will address them. And as I said, it will delay. So the company has said the rollout of, or the connection of HFC customers to NBN by about 6 months. This is putting customers first. This is not going to prevent the company meeting its completion date by 2020, so they assure us.
The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House the Coalition's commitment to public hospital funding in New South Wales, especially in both Gilmore and Bennelong? Is the minister aware of any approaches that are different?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Gilmore, who was a great advocate for medical services before she came to parliament and helped raise funds through Sir Optimists for medical services in her area. And since coming to parliament, she's been a great advocate and champion for the Shoalhaven Hospital. And interestingly, in each year, every year since she's been in parliament, she's helped deliver record funding for hospital services in New South Wales and record funding for the Shoalhaven Hospital in New South Wales. Another thing about her, though, is not just her commitment to hospitals in her electorate and into New South Wales, but the fact that she has character and honesty and integrity of the highest order. She also asks about Bennelong, but not everybody who's running for Bennelong on the Labor side has character and honesty and integrity. And we say that, I say that—
Members on my left.
Oh no, there's only one that's running, and that person does not have character and honesty and integrity. We all know that Christina Keneally was appointed by Eddie Obeid, but what many may have forgotten is that Christina Keneally had to appoint a General Secretary of the Labor Party when she was Premier. And who was it, of all the people she could have appointed, that she picked? Sam Dastyari.
The Minister
Senator Dastyari
will refer to
now.
members by their correct titles.
Eddie Obeid appointed Christina Keneally, and Christina Keneally appointed Sam Dastyari.
The Minister—
The apple never falls far from the tree, but the apple is rotten in this case. So let me focus on Medicare services, which we've already heard are increasing in Bennelong, contrary to the absolute fabrication of Labor's candidate in Bennelong. But we also know that that same person has issued another patent lie, a claim that there have been cuts to hospital funding in Bennelong. And yet we know that in each and every year under the coalition government, hospital funding hasn't just gone up to New South Wales, but through that process it has gone up to the local hospital district in that area, from $220 million to $390 million. So each year, every year, hospital funding has gone up. So yesterday we heard that Christina Keneally flat out lied about her own Medicare weight. Today we know that she has flat out lied about hospital funding in New South Wales and in her own local hospital district. So the lesson at the end of the day is that we are Medi friends and Labor are Medi frauds, and you cannot trust
the Minister's
Christina
time has
Keneally.
concluded. The member for Grayndler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister promised that all Australians would have access to the NBN by the end of 2016. But last week, NBN announced it was immediately halting the rollout of the second-rate NBN to 2 million premises because the technology still doesn't work properly. How much will the HFC delay cost taxpayers?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the claim about 2016 is wrong. I did not say it is wrong.
Members on my left.
Absolutely wrong. I know exactly what we said. I said that everyone would have access to at least 25 megabits by 2016, and when we got in—
Member for Blaxland.
When we got in and did the audit on the NBN shortly after coming into government in 2013, it was perfectly plain that that objective could not be realised. That is simply what the proposition you've made is completely wrong. The member for Grayndler was more convincing when he was talking to James Massola and Nick McKenzie. I assume it was him. Well, do you want to disavow this? Well, what are you doing?
The member for Grayndler on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance, this is a very specific question about the cost to the taxpayers of the HFC delay.
Member for Grayndler will resume his seat. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. So far, the Prime Minister has only spoken about the NBN. Well, he's come to a point about Fairfax, but he hasn't proceeded, and so far he's only spoken about the NBN. So we do have points of order, but we don't have points of order in anticipation. The Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the government has not been advised about what additional cost will be consequent on the delay in the connection of premises to the NBN by customers that are on HFC. But I want to be the honourable members should be very clear about this. The NBN Co is available. The NBN is available currently to around 6.5 million premises across Australia. The 350,000 that it's available to on HFC is therefore a little bit more than 5% of the total. So the rollout is proceeding at the rate of around 40,000 or thereabouts active connections a week. It is the fastest deployment of a telecommunications network in the country's history. What the NBN Co is doing is moving at this extraordinary pace. It's connecting more people every 10 days than Labor did in 6 years. It is an outstanding effort, and what they're doing with HFC is making sure that customers get a great service. They've identified some technical difficulties, and so they're going to get them right. And that's the difference. Labor promised the world, as the minister described, and delivered nothing. Labor promised the world and delivered billions of dollars of wasted investment. We're getting on with the job and connecting and delivering. That's the difference between our government and the failures of the 6 years of Labor government that preceded us.
The member for Maranoa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Small Business. Will the minister advise the House how the government's economic plan is delivering for small businesses and creating jobs for hard-working Australians, including in my electorate of Maranoa? Is the minister aware of any threats to small businesses?
The Minister for Small Business. The Minister for Small Business has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Maranoa for his question, Mr Speaker. He's a hard worker. I'll tell you why he needs to be, because his electorate is 731,297 square kilometres. It's a big electorate, Mr Speaker. If the member for Maranoa's electorate were a country, it would be the 39th largest country in the world, Mr Speaker. It is 3 times the size of your home state, Mr Speaker, Victoria. 3 times the size of Victoria. It's a big electorate. It needs a big member to look after the 23,966 small businesses in Maranoa, Mr Speaker. And he gets around, he understands those small businesses' needs. And recently I was in Maranoa, I visited Dalby, I visited Stanthorpe, I visited Warwick, I visited Roma. Mr Speaker, they're great towns, they've got great small businesses like Nicole's Beauty, like the meatworks there, John D Meatworks, Mr Speaker. All fantastic businesses, Mr Speaker, taking advantage of the instant asset write-off, taking advantage of the lowest tax rate since 1940. 1940, member for McMahon. 27.5%, the lowest the tax rate's been for 77 years, taking advantage of the red tape reduction that the Turnbull government has introduced, taking advantage of single-touch payroll. And just last week, the Treasurer announced the Small Business Digital Task Force, headed by Mark Burris, Mr Speaker. And that's going to be a wonderful, wonderful task force which is going to provide great outcomes for small businesses right around the country, including in Maranoa, Mr Speaker. But I'm asked about the challenges for small business, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm looking at them, Mr Speaker. Labor, you know what, Mr Speaker? Labor likes double faulters.
Doesn't matter what I know.
Labor likes double faulters, Mr Speaker. We are entering a wonderful season of tennis and cricket, but certainly when it comes to tennis, Mr Speaker, Labor are right behind double faulters. They've got Senator Sam Dastyari. He's certainly a double faulter, Mr Speaker. He's folded a couple of times. He's still over there in the upper house, Mr Speaker. The member for Maribyrnong should show a bit of fortitude and tell Senator Sam Dastyari he's no longer wanted, Mr Speaker. But there's another double faulter that we can't put up with in the economy, and certainly the small business of Bennelong can't put up with another double faulter, and that is Christina Keneally, Mr Speaker. What we need in Bennelong is somebody who supports tax cuts. What we need in Bennelong is somebody who supports the instant asset write-off, who supports the red tape reduction, Mr Speaker, who supports the digital task force, who supports jobs. I hear jobs from the member for Kooyong, Mr Speaker. 300,000 jobs created, many of them in Bennelong by business. By business, Mr Speaker. What we need in Bennelong, Mr Speaker, is a real ace. What we need is the Liberal candidate, John Alexander, Mr Speaker, because he will serve up tax cuts, he will serve up the instant asset write-off. That's who we need in Bennelong. Vote Liberal, vote John Alexander.
The minister's time has concluded. Prime Minister.
For that stirring message, I'll ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the